Verma is a fellow, INSEE fellow. She is currently chief economist at the World Resources Institute, India. She formerly was a professor at IIFM. So most of us in this room know about Professor Verma and her work. And she was the director at IIFM of the Center for Ecological, Madhu, what was it? It's a Center for Ecological
Center for Ecological Services Management. So we did
Center for Ecological Services Management. And, obviously a CV that is really long and no signs of slowing down, which is really inspiring for lots of the researchers, the young scholars in this room. Papers in PNAS and all of places, a fantastic study on the value of a tiger. The government of India commissioned IIFM, well actually commissioned Professor Verma to do a study on the economic value of tiger reserves. And I've used that in some of my discussions. I was lecturing to IAS probationers in Mussoorie, and I showcased the work as a part of what is the value of a tiger. You're now doing the Ken Betwa linking, the river linking, and the Panna Tiger Reserve is going to basically disappear. So very fascinating body of work of Professor Madhu Verma. So I can't think of a better person to chair this concluding session of David Simpson's talk. So Professor Verma, warm welcome. Thank you for taking time from your schedule to chair the session for us, and over to you.
Thank you, Professor Srikanth. Thank you very much for having me for this wonderful session and letting me meet David after so many years, and we began working together in the program that we were just discussing before the session formally started, when we had this environmental capacity building, management capacity building program in India with the help of World Bank. And we have 4 different programs to, do training programs, developing curriculum, doing, research together, also overseas, visits. And we had a chance to work with David because David was an expert member in NCAP project, which ran from 1999 to 2001, 2002. And he helped us valuing the hedonic pricing mechanism he was expert on for the Bhuj wetland, the properties in front of that. And that has been the association since then. And had a chance to also meet him while I had gone for World Bank Fellowship when he used to work at Resources for the Future. He invited me for a PISA seminar on the same Bhuj wetland study. And then in 2012, I visited for my Fulbright Fellowship when he was an EPA. So it's been a great learning through David's work, writings, and I'm so honored to having a chance to introduce him also formally because his CV is so impressive. And that's how he's at the center of, I think, this event to talk about the very basic, the heart of the entire ecological economics process, evaluation of ecosystem services. So Dr. David Simpson is a senior professional lecturer at the School of International Service at the American University at Washington, D.C. He did his undergrad in economics from Whitman College and then PhD from MIT in 1989. He's an environmental and resource economist with experience in the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors. He has served as Director of Ecological Economic Studies in the United States Environmental Protection Agency, National Center for Environmental Economics. He was a Senior Fellow at the Resources for the Future, Associate Professor of International Environmental Policy at Johns Hopkins University, and Visiting Professor at the Department of Economics at University College London. Much of David's work has focused on economics of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which he's going to cover widely in his talk today, and strategies for their protection. He has published widely on these topics, as well as on industrial policy, technological innovation, and their interaction with environmental regulation. So he left no stone unturned, which connects to ecological economics approach, because it is a very holistic concept, eclectic concept, and we need to look at these angles as well to provide solutions in a real, in a true way. So that's what he has been doing all his life. His work appears in the peer-reviewed literature books and articles for policymakers and advocates, because he has been widely quoted across the US and across the globe, I must say. Dr. Simpson has served as a coordinating lead author in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a review editor in the UN-funded project on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, where I also had a chance to work with him directly, indirectly, not in the same chapters, but I learned from what he has been doing in these 2 projects. And the Policy of Technical Experts Committee advising the World Bank's program on wealth accounting for valuation of ecosystem services, the WAVES program, the very famous WAVES program, which set the tone for doing integration of ecosystems and economic systems together through the CR framework in India as well. And he was also the scientific committee of the Biodiversity of Economics and Conservation Bioecon Consortium, which he represents regularly in their different programs and conferences. He has performed research, consulted, and lectured in many countries, including Bulgaria, Colombia, Cuba. He has been a great friend of Indian ecological economist and great advisor, I would say, and we have learned a lot from his work. He worked in Nepal, Pakistan, Russia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And at SIS, he directs the Global Environmental Politics, International Development, and International Economic Relations program. So nobody, as Srikanth rightly said, would have been a better person to talk to us about valuation of ecosystem services and kind of experience he has had with variety of sectors, working with variety of stakeholders, gives a very, very holistic lens to present his work, and that's what we have been looking forward to. He already had one talk, and in this talk we're going to get further enriched by his presentation. So very hearty welcome on behalf of INSEE, David, and request you to kindly go forward with your experience sharing and your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's nice to have a chance to speak with you all again. And again, so nice to see so many old friends from a long time back that I do wish that we had been able to convene together in Delhi this time, but I'm looking forward to doing it as soon as it is feasible. Let me just ask before I get started, my voice is a little hoarse this evening. So can you tell me, Aparna, I can see you clearly. Can you hear me all right? Thumbs up? Or?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If it becomes a problem, please do let me know. I'd like to share my screen again, if I may. And I hope I've left it at the right slide. Whoops, that's not where I wanted to be. So I'm going to start in the middle of my slides. Whoops, I should have had that set up. Sorry, I thought I had it on the right page to begin. Okay, so starting in the middle again, I've realized that I probably had way too much material, and if anybody is interested in the more complete version and the aspects I'm skipping over, I'd be happy to share my slides, and I can send that to the organizing committee if you'd like to distribute them to anybody who might be interested afterwards. I thought I might proceed a little differently today. I do want to narrow in a little bit, and I hope this isn't disappointing. I think we were having some broader philosophical discussions last time, which are useful. I also want to narrow in on methods and issues in valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Srikanth asked at the beginning if I could say a little bit about what I had covered last time. And I would say the main impetus last time was to say that we are seeing a number of high-profile efforts to further advance and elucidate the valuation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. A lot of this work is gauged towards aggregating and building up aggregative measures of biodiversity and ecosystem values. But those measures have to be built up from generally speaking, microeconomic studies, from looking into particularities of particular places. And valuation of biodiversity, as with valuation of anything in economics, is really about thinking about marginal values in context. Going back to Adam Smith, value is related to scarcity, and we have to consider whether or not particular aspects of the natural world are scarce in the particular context we're thinking about them. One other thing that I did try to emphasize last time and would underscore again now is that I'm going to be looking at various measures of scarcity and how we go about estimating them. But generally speaking, there's a wide array of values we're concerned with. So I'd underscore again that the point in looking at particular measures and particular values of particular services in particular places isn't necessarily to say that those values are high or low in a particular place, but rather to see whether they make compelling arguments for conservation, or whether we would have to look to other sources of value to make those sorts of more compelling arguments. So again, if I do come up with, in some but not all cases, somewhat pessimistic estimates, doesn't necessarily mean that's true more broadly speaking. It just means that we have to think about where we want to put our investigative effort. So I am going to narrow and focus a little bit on methods. And while I will try to pause from time to time to take clarifying questions, I would like to propose that we defer a discussion of more overarching issues till the end of the formal presentation. I am going to dive a little bit into the weeds now, thinking about how we do valuation of biodiversity. I spoke last time about a couple of examples, valuation of bioprospecting, and an interesting example of valuation of ecotourism values. But now I want to think about some other examples and think about them in the broad context of the approaches we take to valuation. Those approaches are going to break down, well, conceptually, it's all thinking about what is relatively scarce. In terms of the empirical and methodological analytics, it's going to break down into statistical and modeling approaches, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those. I'm going to try to cover several examples here. One that has gotten a lot of attention over time is the use of natural ecosystems to treat pollution and retain sediments. Another example that's gotten a lot of interest in recent years has been pollination, or maintenance of natural systems to provide pollination. And then another one that's gotten a lot of attention is mainly in the context of coastal ecosystems, but often inland ecosystems as well, protection against natural threats such as hurricanes, typhoons, surges. I know some people now listening have done some really interesting work on tsunami protection from coastal ecosystems, but basically protection against natural threats. And then if time permits at the end, I'd like to say a little bit about the combination of what's been referred to in the last few years. I think we're seeing increasing reference to nature-based solutions to climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, as well as combination with the provision of other ecosystem services. So I'd like to talk about carbon sequestration in combination with other ecosystem services. And then at the end, I'd like to go back to overarching thoughts. Let's just remind ourselves, and perhaps this is how I should have started last time, but remind ourselves of sort of what I think is the conventional view of how ecological production functions relate to economic production functions relate to economic value. So in generally speaking, we think about the existence of diverse natural ecosystems, forests, wetlands, grasslands, et cetera, which then provide goods and services, which over and above whatever existence values we might assign to them, aesthetic and spiritual values, we're also interested in instrumental values, providing goods and services to managed areas, to plantations, farms, inhabited areas, such as the plantation here or the village set in the middle of the forest you can see in the corner of the screen. And then when we're doing economic valuation, we think about the combination of that green arrow, if you will, of ecosystem service inputs in combination with purchased inputs, labor, capital, energy, materials, land, the land on which human activities are conducted, which then leads to a resulting measure of economic output, which can be put into monetary terms, or one of the goals of ecosystem service valuation is to reduce these estimates to monetary terms. And then we can have, with some heroic assumptions, make some implications for welfare interpretations. And I think I saw, I had an email correspondence with somebody earlier today about some of the implications of these welfare implications and what we have to assume to make these welfare interpretations. But let's think now about the general considerations in doing ecosystem service valuation. First is that as an analytical proposition, if value is determined on the margin, and we're looking at this concatenation from ecological production to economic production to the value of produced products, we're basically talking about a situation in which the chain rule applies. So if we think about this in economic terms, if we think about having a profit function, sorry, I should have had S as an argument of the profit function as well. What we think of as profit function as being the maximum of the value of output that can be produced with a set of purchased inputs X, and something I'll call services provided by the environment, big S. So the value of the output less the value of the inputs, the profit. If we say that the services provided are a function of the natural area maintained to provide those services, then we can think about the derivative of the profit function, which is really what we're thinking about in terms of ecosystem valuation, is marginal valuation of areas maintained for the provision of ecosystem services. We can subdivide that profit function into the effect of the ecosystem services in area on purchased inputs, and then this chain rule term, the effect of the services on the economic production and the effect of the area on the services. And then we use a couple of economic tricks. That first term is going to be zero by application of the envelope theorem. If we optimize with respect to the purchased inputs, that derivative zeroes out. And so what we're left with is this chain rule term. And so our challenge is to figure out how we're going to determine what the contribution of area maintained for the provision of ecosystem services as inputs into things that we can assign economic value to is. So the next step is thinking about the approaches that we can take to that. And here I want to, and this may be a little bit of technical detail, but just as microeconomic proposition, we can think about this valuation through primal or dual approaches. So primal is basically production function, basically thinking about the biology and technology of production, both in terms of economic production and ecological production, to figure out those derivatives that are going to go into the chain rule expression. And so as an example, when I talked last time about the bioprospecting work, the contribution of ecosystem services was measured in terms of the marginal product, the incremental contribution of the probability of discovery. And then the contribution of area to services was the contribution of area to the number of species supported through a species area curve relationship. So one approach is just to crunch through this analysis of the different terms, the contribution of area to services, of services to production. Now, an alternative in economic terms is to use the dual approach, which would be to estimate the profit function directly as an economic proposition. Profit function should be a function of the price of output, prices of the purchased inputs, and then if there's an unpurchased input, such as the ecosystem services, and by implication, the area providing them, then we could say the profit function ought to depend on the area providing ecosystem services. services. Now we can also take a couple of other approaches. Rather than working with the profit function, we can use a cost function to look at how the provision of ecosystem services by setting aside a larger area leads to avoided costs of other purchased inputs. And I'll talk about an example of this momentarily that Jeff Vincent and colleagues published not long ago. And then another interesting example, and Madhu mentioned this in terms of work she's done, is thinking about profit measured indirectly through capitalized values, so-called hedonic valuation. So how does the preservation of natural resources then translate into profits, which are then capitalized into the value of a property that benefits from the production that takes place there. Incidentally, let me just say that for most of us economists, we typically think when we're talking about the maximization of a profit function, while that may sound like it's very capitalist in its orientation, for want of a better term, under idealized conditions, the maximization of the profit function would also lead to the maximization of social welfare. Now, those idealized conditions are just that, highly idealized. But I just want to underscore that if I'm talking about maximizing profit, I don't necessarily mean that maximizing profit is the be-all and end-all objective, so much as that maximizing profit ought to be consistent with maximizing social welfare, again, under some idealized conditions, but provide us with an interesting benchmark. Let me also just note in passing that while I did mention the use of stated preference estimates in work by Naidu and Adamowicz last time, I'll largely avoid looking at valuation through conducting surveys here. Just let's say, to make a long story short, that gets us into so many other different issues. It's probably best to spend the time just focusing on the reveals preference side of things. So what are the pros and cons about looking at primals and duals? One thing is that if we're really looking at the productive relationships, it does make these relationships explicit. And in some ways, I think it's helpful to think about driving some of these relationships from first principles. I talked about that a little bit in the context of the search functions for bioprospecting, but I'll show a couple of other examples where we could think about sort of intuitive ecological principles. I hesitate to pretend any expertise about ecology, but what seem to be intuitive ecological principles of how production ought to work. And one of the reasons for doing that is I think it gives us a way of potentially cutting through some complications by developing bounding results. If we can find a upper bound, or in some cases lower bound on values, that will give us a sense of the probability or of the possibilities. So those are some pluses of delving deep into the production functions. Some cons are the models can get very, very complicated. And as I was noting earlier, we have these chain rule calculations that the derivative of the ultimate objective with respect to the primary driver, as it were, this area of land set aside, may end up being a concatenated series of functions, which means there's a lot of complications in driving those functions and a lot of compounding of uncertainties as we're estimating different values in there. And then ongoing theme is the econometric estimation. Something like a production function can often get very complicated with omitted variable bias. So what are the pros of the alternative approach of looking rather than looking at a production function, looking at a profit function or a cost function? I think the main one is, in a sense, it cuts the Gordian knot. We don't have to go through that chain of the derivative of this leads into the derivative of that, leads into another expression. We concatenate these sometimes complex calculations. if we can just posit a flexible functional form and estimate a profit or cost function, then if we can plausibly do that, we have our result. I think the biggest problem, though, or going to the con side, there's, I think, really two big problems. Let me actually take the second first. As I'll describe in a moment, some really severe econometric challenges can arise in terms of overcoming selection bias and overcoming potential emitted variable bias. But even if you are able to overcome those problems, the data requirements can be quite daunting for doing a credible econometric study of hedonics or a profit function or cost function. So again, we'll touch on this with some examples in a moment. Well, let's look at an example now. But sorry, let me just take a break for. I've been talking a little bit too much this week. Let me ask, are there any clarifying questions at this point or anything anyone would like to bring up or ask? Madhu, have you seen anything in the chat that I should respond to?
No, I haven't seen any question yet, David. You can carry on. I'll just intervene whenever I find it.
So please do let me know if there are things you'd like me to speak to. There's a long history, I think some of the real seminal work on thinking about ecosystem surface values had to do with the treatment of pollutants and retention of sediments. You can think of sediments as a form of pollution in some respects. So John Dixon and colleagues at the World Bank looked at the effect of deforestation on the deposition of sediment into hydroelectric and irrigation reservoirs as an interesting example. Bro and colleagues did work that was widely cited on use of wetlands for food processing waste in a potato chip factory in Louisiana. This is all sorts of interesting examples. And then Lucy Emerton and colleagues did some interesting work on urban wastewater treatment in the Kampala, Uganda area. And this is a aerial photograph of that. There's the Nakivubu wetland outside of Kampala. And I guess I'm less familiar with examples on the subcontinent, but I do know that there are various wetlands in areas of India. I believe one is in West Bengal that are used for incorporated wastewater treatment systems. There's some interesting evidence from natural science as to how ecosystems provide these services. Paired watershed studies document the effects of land cover on water flow and materials transported. So if you have a situation in which one area has been deforested or one watershed, sub-watershed has been deforested and another hasn't, then it's a good natural experiment to see what the effect is on sediment transport and retention of sediments, potentially other pollutants. Numerous studies have documented the effects of riparian buffers on nutrient and other pollution flows. An interesting aspect of this is that both as a conceptual depiction and an empirical model, exponential decay is often proposed. Let me talk a little bit about one interesting study. And again, I apologize. I know I'm leaving out a lot of interesting examples that we could consider here, but there's limited time, probably more a comment on my my need to review more of the literature than any considered judgment as to which studies to include and not to include. But this is an interesting study that Jeff Vincent and several colleagues did on water treatment costs in a state of Malaysia. It's been well established in the literature on water treatment, the cost of treatment increase with the concentration of sediment in the water. And then Jeff and his colleagues were able to look at a variety of watersheds in the state in Malaysia and relate the existence or the amount of forest cover, the relative forest cover to essentially they were relating the amount of forest cover to the sediment in the water, which was then translated into the treatment costs. But again, the advantage of the statistical approach is that cuts out the middle step, as it were. That Vincent and colleagues could say, we're going to look at the costs of water treatment in these various watersheds, and then relate it to the extent of deforestation in the uphill area without necessarily having to go through the calculations to how that translated into increased sediment flow. It was an interesting study too, and maybe this points to some of the challenges in doing this sort of work, that they were fortunate to have very detailed data. I believe it was about 30 separate basins, monthly data over, I believe, about 17 years. So they had an extensive panel data. With the panel, they could do a couple of things. They could look at the factors that varied between basins and over time, but because of the panel data structure and the fixed effect approach, they could purge out all of the other potential confounding factors that would be eliminated by using the fixed effects. So anything that would remain the same over a particular watershed throughout the time of the sample would go into a fixed effect and would therefore not be a confounding factor in the regression. Let's just say that their general form of regression was to look at the amount, the left-hand side is the log of treatment cost in a particular water treatment plant at a particular time. Right-hand side was the amount of forest cover as a percentage of the area, particular period of time. They added 1 plus the forest cover to avoid zeros, taking a log of 0, which of course would be negative infinity, and basically came up with strong, interesting, but some ways modest results. They concluded that the values, while they did find significant values for forests as for use in water treatment, they're relatively small compared to the opportunity costs of competing land use. And so it wasn't enough to say that the water treatment costs or the savings of water treatment costs would justify the preservation of large areas of forests there. They did point out that there is significant attenuation bias, mismeasurement problems, and unmeasured benefits that might lead to a different conclusion if you're looking at the other services provided by the area. I think this study also raises some interesting issues that could be applied more broadly in this sort of analysis. Attenuation bias is always going to be a problem. We are always necessarily going to mismeasure right-hand side variables. That leads to what, when I was taking econometrics courses, was referred to as the Iron Law of Econometrics. Mismeasurement of the right-hand side variables is always going to bias the estimated parameters towards 0. So for that reason, we'd have one reason to expect that, that the results Vincent and his colleagues found would likely be underestimates. There's also, though, potentially another problem, and this really goes to the need, well, I guess raises questions how detailed we need to have the data. When they looked at the information on forest cover, what they had was data on percentage of forest cover, but not necessarily where that forest cover is related in the is located in the basin relative to the water courses. So if the forest cover could be allocated as riparian buffers alongside the water courses, then that area of forest would likely be more effective than if the forests were retained in farther upland areas and didn't have the opportunity to intercede between areas in which erosion occurred and the water courses received that erosion. So again, there is mismeasurement, but also potentially misspecification. We might need to think about misspecification as well. I just like to mention the idea of a paradox of efficiency here, which is the idea that if an ecosystem can be efficient in providing a service with a relatively small area, that may mean that there's a very compelling reason to maintain some of the ecosystem, but if diminishing returns set in quickly, that reason may not be enough to to maintain large areas. Now let's touch on this with a couple of other examples momentarily. I'm demonstrating here why I went into economics rather than art, but this is my attempt to show a stylized model of the sort of ecosystem that Vincent and his colleagues were looking at. So basically, those triangles are intended to show a ridge. So high land in the middle where the triangles are. And on the left-hand side of this ridge, we have a fairly sparsely forested watershed that's draining into a water body, which is then going to be treated for use in urban consumption. So sparsely forested area. And we could contrast with maybe on the other side of the ridge is a more densely forested area. And it will drain to a river that goes to a treatment plant. And perhaps that treatment plant has lower costs of treatment. The point I want to make here is that this is sort of a case of action at a distance. What takes place upstream in terms of maintaining the forest cover translates into water quality downstream, in this case, probably quite a ways downstream. So downstream, these different treatment plants get different qualities of water. And as an econometric proposition, in a case like this, it's probably reasonable to suppose that the costs of treatment, the costs of water treatment of these plants is plausibly exogenous. It's not co-determined by the same factors as determine the condition of the landscape. So let me try to say that again a little bit more clearly, that the factors that determine we know, or we're hypothesizing, that the upstream sedimentation is increasing the cost of treatment, but there's nothing that leads us to suppose that other factors determining the cost of treatment are also affecting the likelihood of deforestation upstream. So we don't have this reverse causality that would potentially confound results. Now, that assumption is going to be more problematic as we begin looking at different categories of ecosystem services. So if we're looking at services that are most important because of their proximity to adjoining parcels, this idea that the value or the economic activity that goes on in the parcel is independent of the condition of the landscape becomes more problematic. I don't think I said that very clearly, so let me try it again. It's going to be a problem for us if the value of economic activity affects the condition of the surrounding landscape. That makes it difficult then to econometrically estimate the effect of the landscape on the value of activity. So are landscape conditions and property values or profits or costs plausibly exogenous in these sort of cases? So let me show you a little bit of more of my attempt at artwork here. We might suppose that if there's a field of maize, such as this, surrounded by a forest, perhaps the ecosystem services provided by that forest would enhance the production of the maize. So maybe the existence of natural pest control or protection from soil erosion would lead to more productivity in maize production there. So if there were a lower proportion of trees in the landscape, sparser natural areas, then we might expect that the other things being equal, production of the farm, the productivity of the farm would be lower. The problem is that other things typically aren't going to be equal. So might it be that that forested landscape remains intact for some of the same reasons that the value of maize production is low? When, for example, are forested landscapes more likely to remain intact Well, one case might be when they're far removed from urban centers. If they're far removed from urban centers, the cost of transporting grain to market is going to be higher. So the same factors that lead to having a less developed landscape may also be related to the reasons for which land values and value of production are lower. So this leads to a classic problem, estimating the value of adjoining habitats. And there is some interesting work that I think of Elena Irwin as being one of the real originators of this sort of work, although she did it, I believe she began it during her dissertation work at University of Maryland with Nancy Boxstall. And in that work, they identified what I think still remains a serious problem. This simultaneous determination of land use and land value means the value of converting one parcel depends on the status of those adjoining it. And so again, we have this problem of endogenous determination of land use and land value. And this can be compounded further, as Irwin and Boxstall showed in a series of papers, by spatial correlation, that the same factors that make it less likely that one parcel of land would be converted from forests to farms also may make it the case that the adjoining farmland that is converted will be of lower value or lower productivity. So we tend to think of correlation among the error terms as leading to inefficiency in estimation, but Irwin and Boxstall argued that it also can lead to bias in estimation. This problem still hasn't been adequately solved, or people are still trying to figure out how to work with it. So a recent paper by Zip and colleagues said that the existing econometric literature really fully hasn't found this, or hasn't fully examined and found a solution to the endogeneity of land conservation. That's not to say that efforts aren't being made in these directions, and there's really interesting and authoritative review of this by Andrew Plantinga in Annual Review of Resource Economics recently. But looking at the ways in which the tools of modern identification, for which Angus just shared the Nobel Prize, are being applied in land conservation context. So things like trying to find instrumental variables, matching has been used in various instances. And then the other approaches, differences in differences, regression discontinuity, et cetera. And as I mentioned a moment ago, panel methods also increasingly being used, but with some, I think, some controversy as to the effectiveness of the panel-dated methods to get at plausibly unbiased estimates of value. It's not surprising, if you think about it, that if the problem is that the profitability of production is going to be negatively influenced by the same factors that explain why there hasn't been as much land conversion, it's not surprising then that you would have downward biased estimates of value if you don't account for the endogeneity. So studies that do account for the endogeneity of land use and land value have typically found higher estimates of value. And incidentally, people may be familiar with, I think there was sort of a burst of activity in the mid and late 1990s relating landscape value or landscape conditions to property values. Most, or well, virtually all of that work, I think, until Irwin and Boxstall came along, didn't really adequately account for these endogeneity issues. And consequently, I think once that sort of work has been revisited, people tend to find higher values. I think I'll just skip over this slide for now, just say that this is related to work on protected areas of conservation, but I'm running a little short on time, so I'll move through. So in order to work through these or to resolve these problems of endogeneity, one has to find a workable instrumental variable to explain why adjoining habitat remains in its natural state, whereas the land whose value you're interested in looking at is being used for a farm or residence or something. A lot of the instruments that have been used for this, though, raise another interesting question. If one finds that habitat has not been converted because, for example, it's too steep or it couldn't be trained, I guess that's useful for saying that habitat provides some useful services to the adjoining land that is not too steep or isn't too swampy to work. But it doesn't necessarily tell us the key question we want to know, which is, what is the opportunity cost we're willing to forego in terms of conversion? Again, if we're talking about land that hasn't been converted because it isn't attractive to convert it, then it's not necessarily telling us much about whether we're making the wrong decisions with regard to those land conversion decisions. In this respect, I think some of the work on regression discontinuities may be more interesting. Regression discontinuities meaning situations in which land conversion is allowed in some places, but not allowed in other places because of political, where the political boundaries lie. If you could find a situation in which those conversion decisions are made exogenously, then you could presumably identify the effects. Although it's interesting that in the work that has tried to do this, there can be some interesting results depending on whether or not the effects are internal or external to the owner of the land with the prospect of conversion. And again, I think the jury's still out, I think, on the effectiveness of panel data approaches for resolving some of these endogeneity issues. But let me switch gears again. Actually, I think I've probably already talked through this enough, so let me go on to the next slide to switch gears. So one approach is, as I said, we could try to estimate econometrically ecosystem service values. But another approach is to try to model these values, to take a more model-based approach. And I think there are a number of different efforts to do this, but as I believe I mentioned last time, I think the work coming out of the National Capital Project at Stanford University and with cooperation from University of Minnesota Nature Conservancy and WWF is probably the most advanced. And in this work, rather than trying to do clever econometric estimation, what they're typically trying to do is take natural science models, link them together, calibrate them to real world data, and then where possible, work through those sort of chain rule connections to come up with economic values. Now, it's where possible to extend it is an interesting question because this gets really complicated in a lot of cases. Just out of interest, I went back to one of the models in the INVEST portfolio on pollination. Each of these red circles is an element of an equation in the INVEST modeling documentation, which I've linked with an arrow to another equation from which it came, which then has other red circles for other stuff that's in that equation that gets linked to other equations. So as you can see, these get to be very difficult processes to follow, and I think raise some interesting questions as to the propagation of unavoidable errors through the model. As we have all of these interacting factors, can we argue from the law of large numbers that errors between the factors tend to toward a limiting distribution in the overall bias, or are we just adding more and more noise with potential errors? And again, the variables in the models tend to get fairly complicated very quickly. So one of the things I've been, excuse me, One of the things I've been interested in is comparing my own work with what other people in the field have been doing, is thinking about, well, how close do we get with relatively simple models in comparison with relatively complex models? So let me give a couple of examples. So let's talk first about how INVEST treats the problem that Vincent and colleagues did, which is sediment and more generally nutrient transport. And I think it's safe to say that the sediment nutrient transport models are similar. So the INVEST models get fairly complicated too. This is just a page taken out of some of the modeling documentation for the nutrient transport model. But let's look at a schematic view of how this works. This is a page or a figure taken from the INVEST documentation and describes how land use in an upslope area leads to the mobilization of sediment and flow of nutrients, which then will be partially retained in a downslope area. And then eventually some portion of it will be conveyed to a river or stream. So the basic elements are land use and input application upstream generates gross load. Some fraction of that gross load is retained by intervening vegetation. And then if we know, or if we have an economic way of estimating damages, we can look at avoided aquatic damages or avoided treatment costs. So if we said that the edge of field load was some amount L sub 0, we could suppose that the reduction is some fraction. So sorry, that should be an L dot on the left side, meaning the reduction over a certain area of the landscape or a certain width of, say, a riparian buffer would be some fraction times the total load. And so an interesting question is, does that fraction change much over the terrain? Natural science literature suggests that it may not. As I mentioned earlier, a common assumption in the natural science literature is that this is a process of exponential decay. The amount of pollution or sediment in a waste stream moving over a landscape declines exponentially. And so if this is a constant fractional decline, then we can say that the marginal product of another meter of riparian buffer, say another meter of vegetation maintained to filter out pollutants or sediment, would be this expression, the retention or the retention rate, the rho, times the initial load times an exponential function, declining exponential function of the amount of landscape that's maintained. And then using methods that I described last time with regard to the pharmaceutical application, we can find an upper bound on where the marginal value of an additional hectare of landscape, or under what conditions is the additional hectare of landscape with the highest marginal value. And we find that basically an upper bound on the marginal product is inversely proportional to the width of the buffer being maintained, and the E, the base of the natural logarithm, just falls out of the calculations, as it were. Let me talk about an example that I did a couple of years ago, and based on work that I had done some years earlier at EPA. We were interested in the use of riparian buffers in the Chesapeake Bay watershed to filter out nutrient pollution, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, and particularly nitrogen in this context. The inability of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to directly regulate agricultural pollution means that there had to be other means to address the problem of agricultural pollution. And so one of these would be to encourage states to maintain riparian buffers, areas of forests and other vegetation, to retain the flow of nitrogen over the land as it approached streams. So using the basic structure of that exponential retention rate that I described a moment ago, I just parameterized several other things, had some evidence from the literature as to what the removal rates were, what fraction of nitrogen flow is removed per meter of riparian buffer maintained in the landscape. I had an estimate of the density of streams per unit area of landscape. Had an idea of the land value, so I wanted to compare the opportunity cost of maintaining riparian buffers to the value of farmland, and the value of farmland was the opportunity cost. Had some information on the amount of nitrogen that was loaded on land, therefore flow off. And then maybe most importantly, I had an idea as to what the opportunity cost of nitrogen pollution was, that the states were going to be required to increase the costs of treatment at sewage treatment plants if they could not reduce the nitrogen load from agricultural sources. So I said that the avoided cost of treatment was the marginal cost of treating the kilogram of nitrogen at a water treatment plant. Now, in some respects, this is a little different from a lot of the work I've reported, that I actually got fairly interesting, or fairly, I guess, promising results in a way here, that if the removal rate were 2% midway through that range, then you might say that 75 meters of land on either side of streams would optimally be retained in order to treat the pollution. That would mean that if you did maintain 75 meters on either side of the 2.2 kilometers of stream per square kilometer of farmland, you might be preserving as much as a third of the basin, a third of the land in the basin, to provide this nutrient reduction service. Now, interestingly, you run into the paradox of efficiency that I mentioned earlier, and that's the idea that if the treatment if treatment were more effective, you would actually have a less compelling argument for maintaining wider buffers. That if you could remove, say, 10% of pollution, as had been found in some other studies, per meter of maintained riparian buffer, then you might only want to maintain about a third the size of the buffer. And again, the idea here is that if a little bit is providing a very effective service, you don't need to maintain a lot. So in some respects, this is, I think, sort of an encouraging result, that you could make a compelling finding for maintaining riparian buffers. But there are also some interesting aspects of this that might be considered. Most important of them is simply that they're really a very effective way of reducing nitrogen pollution at the source. And again, let me just try to skip down here. I guess I don't really have it on this slide, but I lost my train of thought there as I was looking through the slide. If it were possible to more efficiently reduce the nitrogen load source, that is to tell farmers to stop over applying fertilizer and to change the composition of their animal feed, which would reduce the nitrogen loading, then that would actually also reduce the incentives to maintain the riparian buffers, because then there would be less pollution for them to treat. The main point, though, I wanted to emphasize here is really the last main bullet point on this slide, which is that context matters crucially. That depending on where the buffers are located, you may have larger or smaller values, depending on the source, the intensity of the source of pollution, depending on the sensitivity of the receptors, the values are going to differ greatly. And I think I showed last time, for example, multicolored maps of large continental scale depictions of ecosystem services provided. In order to make that sort of map saying that forest ecosystem services are going to be important for things like treatment value, you've really got to hone in fairly carefully as to what the positions of the systems providing the treatment are. I think I will skip over this, and probably I have, let's see, 11. We're having difficulty doing I've got 10:35 a.m. your time, is that right?
Yeah, so you have 10 more minutes to finish, David.
Okay, does that leave time for discussion? Do we have to be wrapped up then?
Yes, we'll have 15 minutes for discussion then.
Okay, great. Okay, let me, once again, as always, I haven't gone through as much material as I'd like to, but let me talk about another interesting example. I think it's interesting because the biology is linked so interestingly with the economics, but also because pollination has been emphasized in a great deal of the work on thinking about the value of ecosystem services. And incidentally, I should have said in terms of the work I just talked about, one of the reasons I was interested in comparing a simple approach to the more complex approach of the INVEST models is under what circumstances would you want to have a much more detailed model? And I think with the nutrient treatment stuff, it may make more sense to delve even into more detail. I'm not so sure with the pollination. Let me just briefly describe some approaches that have been taken and some interesting findings. There was a well-known case study done by Ricketts and colleagues that I'll talk about in a second, emphasize some of the limitations. It's also worth emphasizing that while we hear an awful lot about the importance of pollination, and certainly pollination is important, but as a relative proposition, while many crops require insect pollination, the world agricultural system isn't by any means completely dependent on it. You see the last quote I have that because so many major staple crops, virtually all the major grain crops, potatoes, can't remember the others, but anyway, some of the largest value crops don't require insect pollination. So this quote says that we would be talking about significant loss, but by no means a catastrophic economic loss if there were a loss of pollinators. Now, of course, it would be catastrophic ecological and moral losses, but just as an economic proposition, it's not as clear. Let me skip over this slide quickly and just talk about a couple of early studies. A really clever study done by Ricketts and his colleagues in Costa Rica looking at the quantity and quality of coffee production in areas closer to remaining areas of forest relative to the more distant areas. They found that the values were higher in areas closer to pollinators, but two interesting things about this: not enough higher to justify the opportunity costs of forest conservation if the opportunity costs were in fact expanding the coffee plantation. And then an interesting observation here is 2 years after they published their study, the coffee plantation was uprooted and planted in pineapple, and pineapple doesn't require insect pollination at all. Ricketts and Lonsdorf then, with Eric Lonsdorf, did another interesting study in which they found declining marginal values with proximity to forest land. And let me just, I guess I'll skip over quickly here that this is a somewhat simplified version of the model they used. It leads to diminishing returns and explains the diminishing returns. But let me see if I can just quickly describe in the time remaining how diminishing returns arises in what I think is an interesting depiction of first principles of pollination. So let's think about how pollination works. In particular, the biology is interesting that you have certain crops that are single, can't remember what the biological term for it is. You have a lot of interesting variants. Some crops are self-pollinating, some crops are cross-pollinating with closely associated crops or other individuals of the species. Some crops require insect pollination. Some crops that require insect pollination sets fruits that combine a large number of seeds, such as melons or gourds. Others, such as almonds or stone fruit crops, set a single seed, therefore require a single visit or a successful visit from a single pollinator. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about quickly here, I modeled a situation such as the California almond crop, in which all you need is to have one bee land and successfully pollinate an almond flower in order to produce an almond. So let's suppose that each bee can visit lowercase phi flowers, and a farmer has planted in an area served by a certain number of bees uppercase phi flowers. So what's the probability that any particular bee visits any particular flower? It's lowercase phi divided by uppercase phi. What's the probability any particular bee doesn't visit any particular flower? It's 1 minus the probability it does. What's the probability that no bee visits a flower? Well, it's 1 minus, it's the probability we just derived that a single bee doesn't, raised to the number of bees. So this last expression is the probability that at least one bee will visit a flower and set a seed, and you get an almond. And then useful trick in all this is if the number of flowers visited by a particular bee is small in relation to the total number of flowers planted in an orchard, then you can use an exponential approximation. So I can figure out what's the value of the marginal pollinator. Again, it's a fairly straightforward calculation. Value of the marginal pollinator is what's going to be the price you can get for the almond that's eventually produced from that, times little phi is the number of flowers visited and pollinated by that pollinator, all times the probability that no other pollinator has reached that flower, pollinated it, and set the seed first. So again, this exponential form keeps arising in a lot of these biological and search problems. Well, I could go through the same sort of bounding exercise I've described in other contexts, but let me talk about the empirical example I worked out and what I think its interesting implication is. Question at this point is, should California farmers be setting aside habitat to provide sustenance for native pollinators? Now, California farmers are, as are farmers for many crops around the US and elsewhere, basically importing European honeybees. European honeybees are taken in trucks all around the country. And the numbers are really quite phenomenal. About half of all domestic honeybees in America are brought to the Central Valley of California to pollinate the almond crop every February. So farmers have this option of using bees to pollinate the almond crop. So in the 1 minute I have remaining, I'll quickly summarize my result here. And this is, again, I would underscore the paradox of efficiency argument. In order for it to be worthwhile for a farmer to set aside part of her farm as habitat for native bees, those native bees, native pollinators, have to be able to compete with rented honeybees. So how much land, which can sell for $25,000 US dollars per hectare, how much land would farmers be willing to set aside in order to avoid the cost, which is a couple of $100 a year, to put migratory honeybee colonies on their land for 1 week out of the year? So the answer is the native pollinators have to be very, very efficient if they're going to compete with the honeybees. If they're going to be very, very efficient, they're not going to use much land. And I found that I think the reasonable upper range of the value you could put, or sorry, the amount of land that farmers would ever set aside if they wanted to use native pollinators rather than honeybees would be about 1/8 of their potential total acreage. So again, this is a situation in which I think you might be able to make a compelling case in some instances that it would be useful to have to rely on this natural ecosystem services of maintaining native pollinators, but it's only going to work if you don't have to put aside too much land to do it. Again, I apologize, I haven't gotten through nearly as much material as I wanted to, but I've also been talking for a long time, so I'll stop now and invite questions and discussion.
Thank you, David, very much for a very invigorating session, giving us lots of information, very thought-provoking ideas, and going into nitty-gritty of actually evaluation and their techniques, because it does look very simple at the outset, but when you start entering into a very dynamic system, very complicated system, I must say, and must understand all the building blocks of evaluation techniques, and then you can proceed in a successful way. So before commenting more on your discussion and your presentation, I would request it's a question from Gayatri. If you can also can you unmute yourself and put the question yourself?
Yes, so big thanks, Professor David, for sharing your insights today. I just had a question on the theoretical basis that we use in most resource use analysis. So we speak about the need to optimize, let's say, forest cover with respect to the use of land for other purposes like agriculture. So I just wanted to know, do you think that profitability models still need to be used at least as a starting point in determining optimal land use? Or can we directly make the transition to non-profit models right from the start?
This is a little bit of a contortion, I guess. And I guess I'll propose an answer, and then you can tell me if I have in fact answered your question. What I'm really trying to ask is, can we make a compelling case to landowners themselves that they would be better served by providing or by maintaining more of the land under their control for the provision of ecosystem services? So when we're talking about things like pollination, I think there's sort of a tough standard to meet, to suppose that a landowner doesn't sufficiently understand the incentives she herself is facing so as to set aside the right amounts of land to maximize her own profits. So I do think a lot of the literature on ecosystem services, to the extent that it's trying to convince private actors to make different decisions, limited in its applicability and its likely impact. I think the bigger question you asked, though, is should we be concerned with the variety of other reasons for which we might want to convince landowners to make different decisions? And to that I say emphatically yes. But then I think it's a question of what do people as local, national, and ultimately global society, what are they willing to pay to compensate those landowners for making different decisions?
All right, thank you so much. I got some good insight. Thank you.
Well, anyone else likes to put any question? You can raise your hand and come forward.
I see
don't
Vikram
really
Dayal.
Shrikant, if you have anything to.
No, I just see Vikram Dayal, and I was thinking that maybe putting Vikram in the spot, but I thought Vikram would have some I mean, I've read this ERE paper of yours, David. So I think, again, a very sort of a provocative result in your characteristic understated manner, that you really can't use the native pollinator argument because of the diminishing return. So, you know, it's too much of a good thing is not a good thing, you know. So I guess that was my understanding of that paper.
Yeah, or enough of a good thing is enough of a good thing, and you.
Yeah. Don't just, yeah. So. Yeah.
I believe I saw Professor Ninen with his.
Yeah, I see Dr. Ninen raising his hand. Dr. Ninen.
It's so nice to see you.
Unmute yourself, Dr. Ninen. You have to unmute yourself first. You are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I put it on the chat actually. I think you overlooked the IPBES pollination assessment of 2017 by Simon Potts et al., where they show that pollinator loss is going to lead to billions of dollars worth of, loss of global food output. And this will have serious implications for food security and livelihoods, especially, since climate change is emerging as a major driver of biodiversity loss in the coming decades, along with, commercial forestry and bioenergy crops. So I think some of the information that you presented, tries to give a misleading impression of how pollinator loss will impact on food output. So at least the IPBES global assessment shows a different picture actually.
I think, curiously enough, I think we're probably in agreement on this. And I think this goes to what I was trying to say in answer to Gayatri's question a moment ago, that I guess I won't speculate as to how many decimal places we're talking about in terms of the loss, or how many zeros in terms of the figures, but there are a great number of different threats, I think, to the survival of pollinators. And we have to think about the most appropriate ways to address those threats. So my intention really with this work was just to say that if the argument is going to be that farmers are going to be better served in terms of protecting or promoting their own output by preserving areas of habitat for the provision of pollinating their own crop, I don't think that's going to prove to be a very effective argument. But I take your point entirely that there are other very important threats and other very important values at risk. So we have to be concerned, I think, with a lot of, particularly with the native pollinators, with the effects of maintaining migratory corridors, for example. So one farmer is not necessarily maintaining habitat on her land for what it's going to offer for serving her own crop, but rather for maintaining the corridor, which is going to allow those pollinators and other organisms that we care about to move as the climate changes. And I think we could go through, I think you make some excellent points. Climate change is, of course, itself a huge threat to not only pollinators, but all sorts of other elements of natural organisms. And particularly with regard to the pollinators, the overuse of pesticides is a potentially huge threat. But in each of those cases, I think we have to make the distinction between what are we urging individual farmers to do on the argument that they're going to find it profitable, as opposed to what do we need to do in terms of societal changes to provide for the provision of those, think of them as more public services or more public goods. I think one of the interesting issues in thinking about things like pollinators, and there's interesting applications of pest control, as well as some other local ecosystem services. One of the interesting issues is, to what extent could we rely on landowners to internalize the externalities? If somebody finds that they get extra benefits from maintaining pollinator habitat on their land, could they just buy up enough land in their area so that they can effectively get all the benefits of doing that? Well, perhaps they could. Maybe we could make sort of a conservative right-wing argument for saying that those sort of on-farm benefits could be internalized. But there's so many other benefits that probably aren't going to be effectively internalized. And that's where I think we need to say maybe something along the lines of, if you maintain this habitat, you're going to get some benefits from pollination, but we also need to convey to you additional payments so you have incentives to maintain the habitat for the various other reasons we think it's wise for you to do that.
Thank you, David. May I request Vikram to kindly pose this question? I could see.
Hi, David. It's been a long time.
Yes, nice to hear you.
Because of Shrikant, I'm speaking up. I wanted to say hello very much. So you and Shrikant were, of course, around when I was doing my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think at a personal level, I'm a little, and I think this has come from you, really. Partly, I'm fairly skeptical of generally the valuation exercises. And this, in a way, we as a profession, it's often presented that, there's an equation of the discipline, sub-discipline with valuation, which I think is not always so productive.
Mm-hmm.
And non-economists get a pretty distorted picture of what's going on. And that's really, you're one of those who's planted that seed of doubt. More specifically, I think you're talking about the Iron Law of attenuation bias, but this you should also say Iron Law of misspecification. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be there. And we know that from Lemer's days. So Lemer started giving up on, he wrote this book on specification searches, and no one really has an answer to that. So we have the credibility revolution because of the Iron Law of misspecification, partly, I think. And so the more you simplify the data generation process. So in a way, a randomized experiment is really, cutting out all the omitted variables in a sense. So then you're really getting, but that's really suitable for things that Fisher originally studied, agricultural productivity. You can carry out these experiments, etc. So
can you please round off your suggestions, because time is really running out? And
good point. So basically, what's your reaction to? And then the thing about panel is there's some hidden things. So if there's a dynamic process, you're using fixed effects, you're assuming additivity, but you might still have omitted variable marks. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I think the points are all well taken. There's always the trade-off between internal and external validity too. And I think this has been interesting to see how the credibility revolution in econometrics has been met by some skeptics of that literature as well, that we can come up with, I think, very credible results for particular contexts, but then as the covariates change over time and location, we're not sure how widely to apply them. And I think you do make an interesting point. Some of the more interesting work, I believe, on the ecosystem services has been done by the biologists who do things like exclusion experiments. We put a fine mesh netting on this to exclude certain pests or certain pollinators, then what are the effects? But then again, I think it's difficult to extrapolate those results to non-experimental settings.
David, half a minute more to answer. Sorry.
I think there is I'm sorry. There was a comment here from Professor Chandrakant. I don't know whether it's come to you, Professor Verma. I'll just read it out. In fact, most food crops are self-pollinated, and pollinators are largely crucial in forests. God is kind to all of us.
Yeah. If I do have a few seconds to just do a wrap up. I think one of the other issues that I haven't really spoken to, but all of this analysis really teases is what sort of landscape do we want to eventually have to be living in? And do we want to be in one in which 1/8 of farm fields are set aside for pollinators, but consequently we have more farms in more places because we're taking more land for the combination of farms and pollinators? Or do we want to be in a world in which we have more intensive cultivation on limited lands and larger expanses of natural lands? I think that remains an issue that's very much open in both the biology and the social science discussion, but its resolution is really critical to how we think about how we want to allocate the landscape between the provision of ecosystem services and the activities that benefit from them.
Right. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for responding to the very interesting queries, very pertinent. They're all burning questions, require, response, require answering, definitely. And it's only a deep dive research further provides, better response to them. And that's what you have been doing, for such a long time. And very invigorating talk. And even I have lots of other queries to make and questions to pose. We'll connect through, email definitely, because time is running out, and we get to the next session. So thanks very much, David, for joining us again for this very, very interesting discussion. Of course, everything connects to well-being these days. People can also realize the connect with these ecosystem services, and they rightly put as nature's contribution to people in the IPBES process, and that's how people connect very well. And thanks very much once again. And thank you, Shrikantji, for inviting me to this very interesting session, giving me a chance to meet David again. And thanks everyone for participating, wholeheartedly and making this session very, very lively and very, very useful. Thank you very much. And I hand it over to Gaurav for the proceedings of the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Madhu. Thank you, David.
Thank you.